And I would like to welcome on stage Sam Dъбърли from EyeWitness Media Hub. We're very glad you're with us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Camilla, and everybody at the AEJ in Bulgaria for having me today. It's a beautiful sunny day. So thank you for sitting inside a dark room and listening to me for an hour. What I want to talk to you about, and everybody at the back of the room, I apologize. Some of the slides you may not be able to see brilliantly. I was standing at the back, it was quite hard to see, but do bear with me and I'll try and explain them as best I can. What I want to, let me just check this, does this work? Yay, fantastic. What I want to talk to you about today for the next 50 minutes or so is the idea, and kind of following on from the session before, is the ethics and how to use content sourced from social media sustainably in a way that enables you to tell better stories and give you some of the trends and thoughts that people in this area globally are thinking about and where we're going in the future. I'll touch on ideas of graphic content, how you might want to use and think about using graphic content, ideas about discovery, ideas about verification of social media content, ideas about vicarious trauma. So the idea that if you're a social media producer, social media editor in a newsroom or in a human rights NGO, and you're looking at a lot of content that could be horrific from Syria, the idea that this actually might have an impact upon you. And then I'd like to talk to you about the audience and how the audience perceives social media content, both in terms of your publications and in terms of when you actually approach the media, when as a media you actually approach the audience to use their content and things you should be thinking about when you do that. Just to give you a brief introduction into my organization. I can't see the slides, that's my problem. I'm gonna have to look backwards, I'm sorry. EyeWitness Media Hub is an organization we founded a year ago as a kind of think tank looking into how industries impacted by social media might want to think about using it in a sustainable way. So what we do is conduct a lot of research and talk to people like you about trying to use it better. So on our website, which is emhub.co, www.emhub.co, we have a lot of resources and tools that you might be interested in looking at and using there. And we're also part of what's being called the First Draft Coalition. The website for the First Draft Coalition is going to be launched very soon. At the moment, there's a page on medium.com, which is the kind of blogging platform, medium.com. So medium.com/first-draft with the number one st-draft. And the First Draft Coalition is a coalition, unsurprisingly, of different organizations that use social media content, EyeWitness Media, user-generated content, whatever you want to call it, in the majority of their work. So Storyful, who you might have heard of, Reportedly, who you might have heard of, Google, I think people here have heard of Google, you might have done. Google is part of the First Draft Coalition and is, the major financial contributor to the First Draft Coalition. Bellingcat, which has been doing a lot of collaborative verification around social media content, especially in Ukraine, and around the downing of MH17. So all these organizations are sharing their experiences, their knowledge through the First Draft Coalition. And my organization, EyeWitness Media Hub, is also part of that. So there's a lot of resources there that you might want to look at as well. I'd invite you to do so. Some of what I'll talk about today and some of the slides you'll see, the resources are actually on either EyeWitness Media Hub website or on the First Draft Coalition website. So when I talk about EyeWitness Media, what do we actually mean about it? We spent a long time coming up with this definition. What we like to think of EyeWitness Media being is original video, unscripted video, that's been captured by an eyewitness to event. So not a journalist, not a human rights investigator, not a brand, but an accidental eyewitness to an event. And then you as journalists, as we're talking to journalists today, see value in that and want to publish it. Okay? So it's not captured by a journalist, but it's published by a journalistic organization. So that's our definition of eyewitness media, which is important because there's a lot of content available on social media networks that is not eyewitness media, right? So what we mean by eyewitness media is then an accidental reporter. Sorry, at the back, you probably can't see this so well. Accidental reporter, so somebody sees a news event, takes a picture of it, puts it on Twitter. A citizen reporter, so there's a staged event going on, and somebody who is a citizen goes to that event and reports on it as a citizen, not as a journalist. A citizen contributor, so they actually want to share in something. The example I use there is morning after the terrorist attack in Sydney last year at the Lind Cafe. And then a unique experience, so something that happens, a tornado, a cat dancing in a funny way, anything like that that's a unique experience that's then deemed worthy by a news organization. What we don't mean, though, is Taylor Swift putting pictures of herself on Instagram. That's not eyewitness media in our book, right? That's PR. Professional commissions, so a news organization saying, oh, to a freelance journalist, go and shoot something, and they put it on their Instagram feed or their Twitter feed or their Facebook page. Or the new trend of YouTube video bloggers. We all saw the one last week of the young girl in Australia who said, I'm having nothing to do with this anymore, and probably made millions of dollars in the process of saying, I'm having nothing to do with this anymore, as everybody clicked on her YouTube video log page to see why. So those for us are not eyewitness media. Essentially, that's public relations. Okay, so I'll be focusing very much on the first part of all this. Why are we interested in this? So I myself and my two colleagues which set up EyeWitness Media Hub, did some research last year at Columbia University Journalism School into how broadcasters use eyewitness media in their output. If you're interested, the website's there, the full report is there, usergeneratednews.towcenter.org. And what we found was, in our content analysis, so these are the broadcasters we looked at, whose content, whose output we were looking at for the amount of eyewitness media used, so BBC, Al Jazeera English, Euronews, CNN, et cetera, et cetera. And we coded 1,200 hours of news content. It was painful. What we saw was every day news organizations are using eyewitness media, right? Over the period, Al Jazeera Arabic, 51 news stories used, down to Telesur in Latin America at 1.6. Okay, not so great, but still, they were using it every single day, okay? And online, they were using it every day as well. CNN International, obviously very famous for its eyewitness report, was using 90 pieces of eyewitness media per day online. So what we realized was, because we also conducted interviews, was that while organizations were using it, they didn't know how to use it, right? They were just, I call the title of this talk the Wild West of social media. It's still very much a Wild West. In every news organization, in every country in the world, it's a Wild West, okay? So don't go thinking for 1 second, oh, the BBC solved all this. They haven't, okay? Everywhere it's a problem. All I want you to do, students and journalists, I think the room is split half and half, is to understand that it's a problem and think about how to use it in an ethical and sustainable way. Because if we don't think about how to use it in an ethical and sustainable way, there's going to be some ruling by the European Court of Justice or some other big international legal body which will very much curtail how we use it at all. So we'll be unable to tell the stories we want to tell. So you can see here, every day in this graph, there was a piece of eyewitness media in broadcast, be it from, and here it was a very small news story, but a helicopter crashed into a pub in Scotland, in Glasgow in Scotland on a Friday night. doesn't matter if you remember it or not. It was a breaking news event, and the whole of that night, content from Glasgow shown on air on every news channel we looked at was EyeWitness Media, okay? During the period we were coding, Nelson Mandela died. Hardly any was used there, which was a shame, actually, because there could have been some great storytelling. But news organizations have spent a lot of money preparing for the death of Nelson Mandela, and they were going to do their stand-up to cameras there and then. They weren't going to bother telling stories in another way. All that to say that it's used every day, but it's a real Wild West out there. And when we also conducted interviews in this research with 70 journalists, senior people at the BBC to junior people working for CCTV in China. We would try to get a real broad spectrum. Nobody knew how to use it properly. And the more senior the person, the less likely they were to know how to use it properly. So if you're a junior producer, bear in mind you probably do know more than your boss, even though your boss will probably say they don't. Apologies to any bosses in the room. So yeah, 64 interviews, 38 organizations, 24 countries. Just to repeat, you know, they did not know how to use this content. They knew it was great, they used it every day. They didn't know how to use it sustainably, ethically, and we heard from the lawyer at the start, in most cases, legally. There's a very, very vague understanding of copyright laws, intellectual property laws, and then the difference between those and terms of service. So often people thought terms of service was the law, which it's not. So it's important to understand the laws in your country when you're using content you find on social media. So as I said, 16% of the content that was on air had no credit. And only 28% of content on air had a description. What we mean by description is actually telling the audience this was not filmed by our journalist, which I also think is very important, right? If you're taking content from social media and showing it to your audience, and then you're not describing what it is to your audience, you're doing your audience a massive disservice because it's not your journalist who filmed it, and you have to be honest about that. Or it's not even a journalist who filmed it, in case, you know, fine, we use Reuters, Associated Press, AFP content from the agencies, both on air and in print. But this is very different. This is not even a journalist who filmed it. In this case, this was 2 years ago, so before the rise of ISIS, etc. But this was activists in Syria. So I think we have an obligation to our audience to tell them, well, these guys have a message, right? These guys are trying to tell us something or trying to share something with us. And that can be from Homs in Syria, that can be from downtown Sofia. And you really need to understand that when you're using EyeWitness Media content in your output, you owe it to your audience to tell them that it was not a journalist that filmed it. So on the back of all this, and with lots of discussions with lots of different organizations, the BBC, the Guardian, the Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, I can name the long list, we came up with, over the last year, 6 guiding principles for handling EyeWitness Media. As I said, back of the room, probably the front of the room, you can't read this, sorry. But they're there on our website, and I would invite you to go and have a look at them. So I'll read through them very quickly, just the headlines. Number 1, journalists should always consider the physical and emotional welfare of eyewitnesses, right? The person, and we'll go into this later, the person could have just seen the most horrific event of their lives, and as a reflex, as I'll show you happens, put it on Facebook, right? And then suddenly a swarm of journalists descends on them saying, "Can I use your picture, please?" This person is probably deeply traumatized, okay? So always consider the physical and emotional welfare of eyewitnesses. Number 2, down here, when requesting permission from an eyewitness to use their content, be transparent, okay? And where possible, explain when and where the content might be used. If you've got somebody might think, okay, I watch the 6 o'clock news, I don't even know if there is a 6 o'clock news, on BNT, the public broadcaster here. They might think, oh, I'm just giving the picture to the 6 o'clock news on BNT, okay? Not even knowing it's going to appear on the website, might get sold to Reuters, might get sold to AP, and then might appear on CNN. You need to be very, very transparent with the individual as to where their picture might actually end up. Consider the intent of the eyewitness and where they might reasonably expect their content to appear. So think about why a person might have shot the picture, right? Is it a private family moment they only wanted to share with their family on Instagram, but they don't understand Instagram privacy settings? And you can work that out, right? As a journalist, you should be able to work that kind of thing out. Always consider the possible impact of any identifiable person in the video or photo. What I mean by that is, there was an example earlier this year of racism on the Paris Underground, on the metro in Paris, by Chelsea soccer fans, football fans. I have a nod here, great. Where they wouldn't allow a black man onto the metro, okay? And they were singing horrible, horrible, vile songs, okay? So there was somebody who filmed that, sent it to the Guardian newspaper in the UK, became a massive story. They ended up, the people on the metro ended up in front of a magistrate court in England. I can't remember if they got prosecuted or not. One person lost his job, quite rightly, etc., etc. However, nobody thought about the guy who was actually being racially abused. And he was clearly identifiable in the video. Now, I wrote a blog post on that. It's on our webpage if you're interested. I would argue it added nothing to the story to be able to identify the man. It would have been just as strong a story with just the same impact had he not been identified. 2 weeks after the event, he gave an interview in the French press saying the only people he'd seen for 2 weeks were his lawyer and his psychiatrist. Before that event, he'd just, horrible to say it, he tried to get on the train, he'd gone home, he was like, yeah, this racism happens all the time, I'll get on with my life. When he became the center of a media storm, it really, really, really impacted his life. So think about the person who's in the video. Ask if and how an eyewitness wants to be credited for their content. When we did our research initially, we were horrified that all these people weren't being credited. And then we've talked to people more and more, and we've realized actually you don't always want to be crediting people, because they could be somewhere they shouldn't be. They could be somewhere they shouldn't be with somebody they shouldn't be on a Monday afternoon, etc., etc. So they might not want to be identified. And I'll come on to talk a bit more in depth about the Charlie Hebdo shootings. I know you talked about it in your panel just before. There was a freelance graphic designer who took one of the pictures of the Charlie Hebdo shootings. And she put the picture on Twitter. It was used by Le Monde newspaper. And Le Monde, without asking her, credited her. Normally I would say, absolutely amazing, that's great, well done, Le Monde. In this case, however, we realized she's a freelance graphic designer. If anybody now Googles her name, all they find is pictures of the Charlie Hebdo shootings. They don't see any references to her work. So always think about how and if, and explain the impact of being credited to somebody. It could be that they still want to be credited, but the choice should be theirs, not necessarily yours. Okay? And journalists should work with eyewitnesses to ensure that they feel fairly treated and or compensated. Now, we're not saying, I'm not saying, certainly, everybody should be paid when you use their content. I don't agree with that. You know, there are some things that are major, important news stories that should be just put out there. But always make sure they are fairly treated. Most people, and I'll come to that later, most people just want a thank you. They want to be told thank you, and they want to be treated with respect. They don't just want their content to be harvested. So think about that. So I'll go in a bit more in depth with some of those, if that's okay with everybody. At this stage, though, I've been talking a lot. Any questions? Am I talking too fast? I have a question here.
Just a second. Yeah, be careful with all the cables.
All right. Among these guiding principles, did you come up with one that concerns the interest of the eyewitness? Because in many of these borrowed or reproduced videos or photos, there might be an interest behind their production. The eyewitness might be somebody taking one side among many. So shouldn't there be the same rule as in covering the viewpoints, the perspectives of all interested sides in how journalists choose which photos, what eyewitness content. And I have Syria in mind when I think about this, because it is the mess that we know it is, to a large extent due to very confused reporting and eyewitness content use.
That's a very, very, very important question and a very good question, I think. So just for those who may not have heard, it's the idea of when we're using eyewitness content, should we remember the idea of balance? Now, I think there's two sides to that, I would say. Number one, eyewitness media, for probably the first time in history, has given journalists a real chance to portray balance, right? So often in history, take the Syrian conflict, for instance, had that happened 15 years ago, all we'd have had to rely upon was Syrian state television, right? We would never have actually seen the other side of what was happening on the ground in Homs, what was happening on the ground in Aleppo. So number one, I think it gives us the opportunity to actually give balance. I think where we go wrong and where we have gone wrong going back to Syria is, and it goes back to my point about telling your audience where the content comes from. Certainly in the start of the Syria conflict, because we were all experts without really knowing what was going on, right? We never explained properly where the videos came from, which led to us probably putting out ISIS propaganda as ISIS was being born as Syrian rebels, i.e. Assad was the bad guy, then there's all these other guys, right? Which I think has led us to this situation where, let's say 6 to 9 months ago, it's changed now, we were putting out a lot of ISIS content and actually doing their propaganda for them. I think we're getting better at it. We're still not perfect at it. And I think doing it well gives us the possibility of telling both sides of the story, telling a balanced story like we never had it before. So does that help? I mean, I think it's about explaining. It's really about explaining where the content came from, not just taking it and saying that's the story. In a breaking news event, no problem, Charlie Hebdo, and we'll come into Charlie Hebdo in a second. You're just reporting facts. When it comes to the whole Je suis Charlie thing, we weren't actually, because we were all journalists in Charlie Hebdo, and we were actually deeply impacted by it, we tended just to report the Je suis Charlie side and ignored the, wait a minute, you know, I find these guys deeply offensive. While I don't condone for 1 second terrorist attacks, I don't condone Charlie Hebdo either. And we kind of miss that subtlety. So we need to avoid jumping on eyewitness media bandwagons, I'd say, and always remember there's two sides. Any other questions at this stage? Yeah, please.
I have a question about time. So, because many journalists, it sounds great, but many journalists would say, okay, I need to publish it quick. I must be active about it, reactive. I must do it now. I don't have the time to ask about this, to explain the eyewitness this and this and this. I could do it retroactively, but not before I publish it. I need to be quick. They even discussed it in the previous panel. Did you have it in mind when you...
I didn't have it in mind here now. I have an answer, though. I think it's really dangerous with social media to be first and wrong. I'd rather be second and right. And I think it's a lot better for your brand. And it's in this space now, there are so many, I don't know the situation in Bulgaria so well, but my feeling is it's a very crowded media market space. There's so many competitors, and the audience is increasingly demanding ethical journalism or constructive journalism. So if you're the organization that just throws stuff out there, I think at the end of the day, your brand is going to be damaged. And I think if you take a deep breath and say, we're not necessarily going to be first, we're going to be quick. We might not be the first. We might not be the one who we might be half an hour later than our competitor. But we've been through all the steps. And I would argue, we're all journalists, right? So we're all a bit navel-gazing. We like looking in the mirror. We like to tell ourselves and our friends over a beer, we were first. Your audience doesn't remember that. The audience remembers who was wrong. More often than not, I would argue. So it's better to take a deep breath, go through these steps. Of course, I would argue that, right? You can disagree, that's fine. Go through these steps, make sure you've verified the content properly, and then publish, rather than just say, hey, that's a great picture, let's put it out. I hope that helps. I'm going to move on, just in question of time. I want to spend a little bit of a discussion on the Charlie Hebdo shootings. This, for me, was one of the biggest stories that illustrated the power of EyeWitness Media in a breaking news situation. And this video in particular. And I know you talked about it in your previous session. I didn't quite understand the intricacies, but I know you talked about it. This is an assassination of a police officer called Ahmed Mirabet that was filmed by a man called Jordi Mir, okay? And we'll go into that. But this, for me, was the picture from the Charlie Hebdo assassinations. But there was also a lot of other social media around that. And I just wanted to run through what some news organizations did in this space, because I think it gives us some really valuable lessons. So it's really important to understand that this picture here was one of the first to appear. Quite an innocuous picture, really. A hole in a window, obviously from a bullet, but a hole in the window all the same. Shot by a guy called Yves Cresson. Very quickly, Yves Cresson was tracked down by very talented social media journalists like yourselves, and he was attacked, basically. Daily Mail, can we use this picture? Reuters, can we use this picture? Somebody even, obviously these are all British examples, somebody even thought about, shock horror, writing to him in French. This guy, Ian Mitchellmore, actually got a reply, the other guys didn't. The lesson here, think about where the event took place. You might not speak the language very well, but Google Translate exists and is actually quite useful. People really appreciate being contacted in the language they speak. And Yves Cresson, we had no idea if he spoke English or not, right? So all these very clever, very smart social media journalists who could track down Yves Cresson, track down the picture, asked him in English. Yeah, I wouldn't. This is another important point. This guy, Matteo Maillard from Le Monde newspaper, found this very nice picture by, I don't know if you can see, on this side, Engelbach in the area around the Charlie Hebdo office. Okay, you see a car, you can't see it great, but you can see a car and the brothers getting into the car, okay? He tweeted that with a credit to Engelbach, very nice. He's not so popular on social media. He got retweeted 289 times. His colleague, also from Le Monde newspaper, Elise Barthé, saw the same picture that Matteo tweeted. She put it on there, cropped it a little bit better, so we could actually see the car, didn't take the original. Smart woman. That was retweeted 4,428 times when we took the screen grab. She didn't credit Engelbach. It gets worse. People then, other journalists, start saying, hi Elise, the retweeter lots of times, can NBC News have permission to use your photo with credit? Elise is a very nice woman. She says yes to somebody else's copyright. Now, I'm sure there was no malice of intent in Elise Barthé's actions, but you should know, all of you in this room, it wasn't her copyright to give away, okay? So think about that when you're retweeting pictures, when you found it on social media. That's not using Angelbar's copyright in a very nice way, okay? The answer should have been, it's not my picture, you need to contact blah, okay? And see how she wants it to be used. Now, it comes back to your question, right? In the speed of the moment, la, 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 la. And I agree, in the speed of the moment, we do things maybe we don't think, we're just like retweet, retweet, retweet. You know, there's the old saying that there's nothing more dangerous than a well-meaning person with no time on Twitter who just retweets misinformation because they think it's important. You know, we've all had those chain emails from our grandparents of, you know, watch out for such and such a virus and so on and so forth. There's nothing ill-meaning in it. It's just we should have these in our, they should be part of our journalistic reflexes, okay? She carried on, look, MSNBC, everyone, you know. And then we come down to some of the more graphic imagery. And I'll talk about graphic imagery again later on, assuming I don't run out of time. How are we doing time-wise? Okay, we're okay. Different people saw the Merabet video in different ways and used it in different ways. These are all by journalists. Elliot Higgins, who you may have heard of, gave a link to the Facebook page where the guy who shot the video initially put it up. This person here took a scrape of the whole video that was on YouTube. The original was not on YouTube. Put it up. Somebody else put on a still image of the picture. Somebody even liked the YouTube video of the death of Ahmed Merabet. You know, I'm sure, again, not in ill intention, but saying you like that video and tweeting it, you know, probably not the impression you want to leave. So think about those things when you're liking videos and all those issues, because it doesn't do your brand much good. Where am I going on to? And then this is my favorite one. I live in Istanbul in Turkey. I'm not Turkish, but I live in Istanbul. So I know the Turkish media very well. I saw this video, which is the death of Ahmed Merabet, cut down into an autoplay 6-second GIF. So you had no choice but to see the GIF. But it's okay, because Hurriyet said 18 plus. Maybe not the best way to publish the assassination of a human being. You know, editing it down into a GIF and making it autoplay on Twitter. You need to think about the moment of death. You know, in the old days when I was, you know, training to be a journalist, we'd never show the moment of death. This was a new area where, in different ways, organizations decided to show the assassination, the moment of death of a human being with gunshots. I would argue, personally, that wasn't necessary for telling the story. It doesn't further our knowledge of the story. We could have decided, some organizations chose to use the video in some ways and edited it down to show what happened without showing the moment of death. The worst for me was this one. Hurriyet, great, well done, thank you. You know, 6 seconds, the moment of death without Merabet's body being any way blanked out. Again, probably the time issue. They thought, shit, we've got to get this on air quickly, or on Twitter quickly. We've got to beat our competitor, huh? They had time to edit it, of course, you know. It was, I wish I had the time code of when I found it, I don't know. Just probably not ill-intentioned, but just not thinking, right, about the implications, the ethical implications of using social media, EyeWitness Media, in a correct way. This is long, but it's worth reading. Will you bear with me while I read this to you? Is that okay? It's really quite a good lesson, all right? The video was filmed from the living room of a man called Jordimir. And we spoke to Jordimir about 2 months after the event to have him, to get his thoughts on the video. And it's really quite educational. So just bear with me for the back of those at the back of the room so you can see it. So my name is Jordi Mir, the idiot who put a video on Facebook. If I put it on Google+, nobody would know me. Anyway, there's nobody from Google here, right? Okay, good. On that day, at about 11:30, I was in front of my computer when I heard detonations. I picked up my smartphone from my desk to film what I thought was a bank robbery. Opening the window, I saw a black car parked in the middle of the pavement. A police officer running along the pavement caught my eye. There were gunshots and he fell, wounded. I saw 2 men dressed in black advance towards him. I thought they were his colleagues coming to help, but they assassinated him. I continued to film as the men returned to their car, although I moved back a little because if they had lifted their heads and seen me, I could have been a target. I waited for a while before looking at the video on my phone. I thought about transferring it to a USB key to give to the police. I went down to talk to them, and 2 officers came up to my apartment, and we did just that. In a state of shock, I needed to share my experience, and I put the video up on my Facebook page. Friends telephoned me, and while explaining to them what happened, I took back hold of my senses and decided to take the clip down from Facebook. It must have been up for about 15 minutes. Never put a video on Facebook, says Jordi. Never. Because Facebook does not protect videos in MPEG-4 formats. It's very easy to copy a video from Facebook. Very few of my friends made the connection between me and the video, even those who know me in real life. On my Facebook list of friends, I have a few who are French journalists. Not one of them contacted me. When I did the interview with Raphael Slatter of AP, only 3 people out of 2,500 sent me a direct message of support. A young YouTuber, a friend of my friends on Facebook, quickly put the video on his YouTube channel. He managed to pass himself off as the person who filmed the video and managed to sell it. Since the video appeared, many sites doubted that it was real, even casting doubt on the death of the police officer. I asked Google to take down a video put online by Storm Clouds Gathering, which questioned the death of the officer using my video. Google refused. The video has been viewed 3 million times. And he finishes with a question, which we can all answer ourselves. Can the media copy a video shot by an individual and broadcast it without asking permission? I guess the answer to that is yes. We left that intact because I felt it was very important that, we felt it was very important that Jordi was allowed to speak freely because he'd seen such a traumatic event. But I think what he says touches on everything I've just talked about up to now, you know? This idea of thinking about the eyewitness when you contact them to use their content. You know, he was in a state of shock. He put that video up for 15 minutes. It was found by every social media journalist I know in those 15 minutes. People know how to find this content. It's easy, right? Just with a few skills, it's actually very easy. The other issue is somebody scraped and stole his video and passed it off as their own. So some news organizations didn't find the Facebook video, found the YouTube video, contacted the guy and said, can we use it? And he said, yes, if you give me 100 euros or 50 euros or 25 euros or whatever. And they thought they'd made a deal with the copyright owner. They hadn't, okay? So it's this, going back to this idea of Wild West, right? Jordi Mir is a very traumatized man by this experience for several reasons, one of which is how he was treated by the media, okay? Now, I'm not saying the video should have been used, should not have been used, rather. I'm saying the moment of death shouldn't have been used, that's my opinion. I'm not saying the video shouldn't have been used, it was an important story to tell, an important video to tell a very important story, and there's the idea of fair dealing, which, you know, legally, in the UK at least, you'd be protected in the first 24 to 48 hours if you use that video. If you used it later, there'd be an issue. I'm not saying it shouldn't be used. I'm saying you need to consider how the uploader is, how the uploader is feeling, what the uploader may have seen before you put out that video. I want to move on a bit more onto other areas of graphic imagery, having done the kind of tour de table of Charlie Hebdo. Any questions on that at this stage? Or carry on? Okay. If there are questions, just throw your hand up at any point. Okay, no problem at all. So I want to think about some of the other sustainability issues around graphic imagery, how we use them for our audience, but also how you use it yourself, okay? So in terms of the audience, there's been research recently published by Holman, Garfin, and Silva about the media's role in broadcasting during the Boston Marathon bombings of 2012. This research says that reported bombing-related media exposure was associated with higher acute stress than was direct exposure. So what that means is people who were watching the Boston bombings on TV, online, reading about it in their newspapers, had more stress than people who were there, right? Because you're consuming it, and because the media is spewing it out, you led to more stress, more anxiety than people who are actually there and experience the event, okay? So when you as journalists are publishing this, think about that. Think about the impact on your audience, okay? I know we have stories to tell. I'm not saying for 1 second we shouldn't be telling bad stories. Please don't take it that away. But think about the ways in which we tell the bad stories and how we might want to tell them so that might not happen as much. One of the first examples of this that I remember was the Woolwich killings in London in 2013. And a gentleman was walking past, and this guy who'd just murdered an army officer in the streets of London was standing there with blood on 2 knives, telling the world why he'd done it. That was broadcast by ITN, the British news channel, who effectively bought the phone off the guy. They kind of went, here, I'll give you a lot of money for your phone, and they got it exclusively. It's a horrible, if you've never seen it, don't bother. Read about it maybe, but don't watch the video, it's horrendous. It's deeply disturbing. This guy just rants and rants about why he's just murdered somebody. He's standing there with a machete covered in blood. You know, you don't need to see it. But it kind of highlights the power that these tools have now to tell the story. And because ITN bought it and broadcast it, they received, I think, a record number, something like 800 complaints. They received a record number of complaints to the UK's media watchdog. They later changed how they broadcast it. So they edited out the hand with the knife and just used it in an illustrative manner, not in a full storytelling manner. And we did research into the audience and how they feel about this, right? Just EyeWitness Media, that's more graphic than what we were used to maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And this is what the audience was saying. They're saying, it upsets me. You can't get away from it. It will really stick with you. So this really has an impact on your audience. And as one person said in one of the focus groups we ran in the United Kingdom, I couldn't avoid it, right? It was just hit her in the face. She couldn't avoid it. I pick up the Metro, which is a free newspaper that they distribute on the London Underground. I pick up the Metro every morning, and I wish I hadn't seen it. I saw someone before they died. It was horrible. So it really has an impact on your audience. And I think there's a difference, looking around the room, most of you are too young, but for instance, in 2002, 2003, during the American-British invasion of Iraq, and the car bombings that ensued in Baghdad afterwards, in 2003, 2004, generally you get one feed by the agencies every day of the video of the car bomb. The camera person had arrived too late, 15 minutes after. So the fire brigade had already put out the explosion. It was a professional journalist. They knew how to film it. And it was sent to London, normally to Reuters or Associated Press, and then it was distributed to the world. So you'd have one video shot by a professional, 15 minutes after the event, and edited and filtered before it got to your newsrooms. Now anyone can find that, right? ITN sent a producer down to the streets of London, and instead of going around interviewing people, they told the producer to go around asking everybody if they'd shot anything on their mobile phone. There's a change in news gathering tactics, which meant they got the immediate aftermath. 10 years ago, no journalist would have seen that. No audience would have seen that, right? Now we're giving our audiences content that is far more graphic, far more immediate than we've ever seen before. So we need to think about that when we're publishing, because I think our audiences are going to get, weary, compassion fatigue about the amount of horrific content they're seeing. However, we're making it easier. And this is just a challenge. I mean, Periscope, I think, is a fine, fine thing. It's a great thing. Again, I live in Istanbul. Periscope was born during Gezi Park. And going back to your point before, if it weren't for social media and things like Periscope and Twitter, YouTube, we would have never known the other side of what was going on in Gezi Park in Istanbul in the summer of 2013. I'm a great advocate. But Periscope now allows us to see the actual moment by people who are not trained journalists like yourselves. So this is the example from, do you remember the Bangkok bombings 2 months ago, 3 months ago? Nods? Good. A gentleman was there. He switched on his Periscope. And he was filming. He was just filming the aftermath of a bomb. Immediate aftermath of a bomb. And he kept it up for a whole period. Here, if you can't see, at this point on the screen here, we have 387 people looking at it. That's, I think, for Periscope. Does anybody use Periscope in this room? Yeah, one. See, one person, two. We have three. Okay, 3 people use Periscope in this room. It's not the biggest used social media network yet. Yet 387 people watching this. And during the whole of the stream, only 1 person turned it off. Okay? And people comment now on Periscope, right? Those who don't know, you can actually join in a little conversation when you're watching a live stream. It's great. It's actually great. However, this person says, this will be a defining moment for Periscope, broadcasting live news. Somebody says, anybody dead? Are you a reporter? Do you think terrorist yet? Is he reporting? This is how the reporter reports the news. And the comments kind of went on, oh my God, what's that? Oh, that's part of somebody's body. I don't think I want to know, but I'm curious. That's a head or another part, a head? That's so sick. I just saw red. We're allowing people to see the immediate aftermath. And it reminded me of, some of you in here might remember the Beslan siege, 2004, in Russia. And Associated Press was the only news organization there broadcasting live. And as the siege was broken, we had these horrific pictures of these children running out of the school. It really impacted me personally. And led to some UK live news organization, Sky News, introduce a 7-second delay to live broadcasting because the pictures were so traumatic. We didn't see heads or blood or anything. It was, naked 12, 13-year-old children who'd just been held hostage for a week, running out of a school. It was deeply, deeply traumatic. And yet, because AP was broadcasting live and nobody thought about the impact of that, major news organizations broadcast it live to the world. This is the same thing with Periscope, except again, the risk is we don't, because it's not a journalist filming it, we don't treat it in a way, and we have the risk of running, heads, dead bodies. And people were asking this guy to go and film closer, right? They're saying, can you go film that bit a bit closer? And he was doing it. So Periscope's about to launch an app on Apple TV, which will make Periscope broadcastable quite easily. You can just plug one into your MCR and up it goes, right? So we need to think carefully about engaging with new technologies such as Periscope. This is also the issue of autoplay. Have any of you in this room been like looking down your Twitter stream or Facebook stream, and suddenly this video starts playing and you're like, oh my God? Yeah, I have, but yeah, gentleman there. This was the Virginia shootings, right? Every journalist, again, found very quickly the guy who did the shootings, was following his Twitter stream. Everybody was really worried that Twitter would turn off his account because, you know, he just committed a terrorist act, effectively. The Daily News in New York Daily News, decided to put the picture of the killing on their front page, which I think, it doesn't add to, for me, it didn't add to the story, you know? I know that the people are dead. I don't need to see how it happened. It's like, you know, I like eating sausages. I don't need to see how the sausages are made, you know? And then autoplay was happening. So I was talking to the social, she won't mind me naming her name, the social media intake editor of Sky News, the big UK live news channel. And she was saying, you know, she had the guy's Twitter stream open because she was terrified, as I said before, she was terrified of it being turned off. And so she just had this video of the assassination of 2 human beings permanently playing on her Twitter stream because she couldn't turn it, she was too scared to turn it off that it would disappear. Yeah, it meant she was forced to look at it all the time. And it's also the same for our audiences. So there's huge issues around autoplay. And that means when you're producing videos for social, think about autoplay, right? Think about the fact that somebody on Facebook just scrolling down, find your video, and it just hits them in the face. So you need to edit appropriately in that regard. That's a bigger journalistic question, not an eyewitness media question. But it's also think about when you publish on social, on Facebook, on YouTube, there are settings to turn off autoplay. Most people don't know where to find them. I don't. I'm sure I could if I bothered, but I don't. But it's a real important issue to think about autoplay. How are you time-wise? Got another 10 minutes. And then I wanted to talk to you about news gatherings through social and the risk of traumatic content affecting you. Now, I'm doing research at the moment, which we're publishing next month, into the idea of vicarious trauma. So if you're a social media editor, you're looking at a lot of horrible stuff from a lot of horrible places, mostly Syria, barrel bombs in Syria, that kind of thing. 2 years ago, when we did our original research, we asked questions about trauma and eyewitness media. And this was the answer we got from senior editors. I've been watching graphic footage since 1988. I don't think there's any difference. I disagreed, so I started this research. And the answer now is very much, you witness trauma a lot more with UGC, eyewitness media, UGC. You're exposed to more intense visual material than a battle-hardened war cameraman sitting in Sarajevo in the middle of the 1990s. For all the reasons I've explained. It's immediate, it hits us straight away, periscope, autoplay, it's everywhere, okay? So if you're a journalist dealing with social media now, or you're a student who wants to deal with social media in a newsroom in the future, please do pay attention to this. Because journalists and editors working with UGC do believe that seeing traumatic content is part of their job. I agree. I'm not saying we shouldn't be seeing it. It's our job to bear witness to what's happening in the world. How we can bear witness has changed. We need to see traumatic content, okay? We need to prepare ourselves for seeing it, though. Because before engaging with traumatic UGC, so students just out of journalism school, people who've just been hired or moved within organizations to become social media editors, 37% did not even think about the fact that they would see traumatic UGC of the journalists we spoke to. This is over 200 journalist sample size. 46% were not prepared. And 56, sorry, there's a formatting problem with the slide. It's not quite finished. 56% had not considered that seeing traumatic UGC, and the words that are missing there, would have an impact on their personal life, even though it had. Because 21% of journalists we spoke to, or surveyed, said they believed seeing traumatic UGC had had an impact on their professional life. And more staggeringly for me, 46% of the 200 journalists we surveyed believed it had an impact on their personal life. And they were taking this home with them. They were seeing bombings from Syria, they were seeing periscopes from Bangkok, and they believed it had an impact on their personal life. So if you're a journalist or want to be a journalist, please do think about this. There's lots of resources out there. I can share them with you after this, but do think about it. It's an important management issue. This slide is normally a lot prettier. I'm sorry, it's the formatting and it's a PDF, la la la. Even in organizations, so this was a quote from, the top right there is a quote from a very senior manager in a very, very big international news organization, okay? This person says, there is a question of will admitting being traumatized have an impact on my career? Because it won't, but people think it will. Breaking that is important. So this is a call to managers to say, make it clear that if you're young, just out of journalism school, social media producer, thinks they have an issue, you need to create a culture where they can talk about it. Otherwise, that person's going to leave their job very quickly. And you're putting it purely numerically, you're going to have the business, you're going to have to spend money on recruiting somebody else and training somebody else. So do it sustainably, otherwise you're going to have a very high headcount turnover. Because, sorry, the formatting issue, this was in the same organization, but somebody very junior people are saying, I feel like I cannot say no to looking at horrific content. The end of that sentence is, because I'm scared it will have an impact on my career. She's worried that, the person was worried that if they said, I don't want to look at this, they'd be taken off the social media desk. They wouldn't be allowed to go to an event that they wanted to go to or a conference they wanted to go to because they'd be seen as too weak and it would have an impact on their career. And it shouldn't, because talking about it is one of the most important things to actually cope with looking at traumatic content. The other issue is workflows. So one of the most important things, one of the most traumatic things about looking at content sourced from UGC, from EyeWitness Media, from social media, is surprise. So if you're not expecting to see a video that's deeply traumatic or a picture that's deeply traumatic, it's going to hit you a lot more. So the quote at the bottom, I'll just go with that one. This was a picture of the young Syrian boy found not dead on a beach in Turkey about 2 months ago, if you remember. Yeah, nods. Not a particularly graphically horrific picture, but a horrific picture nonetheless. And this editor, senior editor, he won't mind me saying it, a senior editor in his 50s, mid-50s, so a very experienced journalist. This guy had been the bureau chief of a big news organization in very, very, very horrible places in the world. He's been around. He walked into the office on I can't remember what day it was, Wednesday morning, I think. And somebody came running up to him and said, we've got to publish this, it's really important, it's really important. And it was a picture of Aylan Kurdi. He said he was walking into the office and a colleague ran up to me and said, look at this is really important. And the important bit here, the guards hadn't got up yet. He wasn't prepared. And he spent the whole evening in tears. He was saying that if somebody had told him, you need to look at this, but prepare yourself, it's really horrible. Go sit down, get logged on, have a coffee, and then come and look at it. It would have been a lot easier for him to cope with. And this applies in workflows. So if you have a video that you're putting into your server, label it as graphic. Don't just, you're a journalist, you think but in the workflow of your newsroom, assuming there are broadcasters in the room, I'm speaking very broadcast here, in the workflow of your newsroom, a lot of people look at videos that you don't think about, will look at them. So editors, archivists, people who work with agencies, people who sell your content, things like that, they will look at a lot of content. So think about your workflows and how you label stuff on your servers. When you're telling people about videos, tell them that you're going to see something horrible, that kind of thing. I'm running out of time, right? 5 more minutes? Can you bear with me for 5 more minutes? Yeah, absolutely. I'll spend the last bit just on how do you talk to your audiences. We talked about it before. in the Ahmed Merabet and Charlie Hebdo. These are all real live examples about how journalists ask for permission to use content. If anybody understands this language, put your hands up, go on. Hi, I'm with news organization, Can, my news organization, and all domestic and international affiliates use these photographs in perpetuity on all platforms and online. Anybody understand? No. And this is like, you know, a tweet message to one of you. What else? Reaching out from Blur. May we permanently license your photo for all platforms and affiliates? People are using, news organizations are using, because they're scared, because they don't understand the law, and they don't understand terms and conditions, they're using legal language when they don't have to, right? So the audience is not understanding what you're actually asking. You think you're telling them, and you're not. Okay, you're making it more confusing. Generally, people will say yes, and then be very surprised, as I said before, when their picture appears on Australian television because your organization has a deal with Reuters, which means any piece of social media content you put out has to be given to Reuters and then distributed around the globe. People need to understand that when they're being asked to, when you're asking them to use their content. Using this language is really, really bad, and obviously, I'm sure there's similar language in Bulgarian. I'm using English examples. But using that language is really, really bad. So approach people in a human way. It's really, really important if you want to get them on your side. And I'll finish with this. Because, so, this picture in Brighton. I hope everybody's okay. Gets lots of requests. This person, Andy Touch, says, news journalists be like... Any idea what the next slide will show? Go and guess, one person. Silence. News journalists be like vultures on social media. So all that to say, you know, please think about these different areas around sustainably and ethically and in your own interest when it comes to graphic content, using social media content, EyeWitness Media, because it will help you tell better stories, it will make you be able to use it in the future, and it will be really, really good for your brand, for your organization's brand. I'll stop there, but any questions?
I did it.
Don't be shy.
Okay, then I'm going to ask the first question. I was really interested in the management part and the fact that the journalists should discuss that, but how would you comment if you have a really small market with really small newsrooms who even, I mean, Bulgaria is such a case, for example. You have one social media editor or you don't have even one, and just the journalists, the regular reporters are actually also handling online and social media, so they don't really have the experience. How can such small newsrooms adapt and also take care of the feelings and the way their journalists work with such type of content?
So when it comes to, great question. It's a very important question. And just to point out, you know, when we were doing the interviews and surveying people for the study into trauma in the newsroom, we spoke to big news organizations and we spoke to very small ones, okay? And it wasn't always the big ones that got the answer, right? Sometimes it was the small ones who actually were a lot better. So it is something that's achievable in a small newsroom when there's management will, okay? So number one, management will is really, really important, okay? Really important things when thinking about this is, it's like radiation, nuclear radiation, right? You want to limit your exposure. You want to do it in a way where there's not going to be one person in your newsroom being hit with it all the time. So it's about structuring workflows around that. Obviously, if you've got one social media editor, that's hard. But then that one social media editor needs to know that they can speak to somebody, that they're not working on their own, they're not sitting in a dark room. It sounds really, really crass in 1970s, but like having some plants around is actually proven to help. Like green is a color that helps people cope with this kind of stuff. Then there's all sorts of little tips about how to actually look at the content. So don't have the volume turned up. People find hearing the sounds of gunshots or hearing the sounds of screaming, bombs, that kind of thing, it makes it more traumatic. Other tips would be don't view the video or picture in full screen if you're going through a verification process, right? Minimize the screen. So it's about understanding your newsroom, it's about the managers being concerned, and it's about learning the different tips and different tools that are available to help you deal with that content. And that's achievable in every single newsroom, big or small. There's an organization called the DART Center, and they have a lot of tips on their website for journalists dealing with social media content and traumatic social media content. And they're really, really, really useful.
And I just want to ask something because I'm interested. Have you ever, the ones in your newsroom or in the university, talked about those issues with your colleagues or with your management or with your professors?
I can guess what the answer will be.
I don't see any.
You do?
Да, добре, ще ви попитам. Да. Може би да you can share maybe your experience.
Yeah, when we discuss should we use something or not, for example, the video with Charlie Hebdo, we also discuss how this affects everybody from us, and should we want this to happen to our readers. So I earlier mentioned that the first level to decide for something is, do you want to see, for example, the Syrian boy on the beach and to be your relative or child, or so we decide then to use pictures that only show the boy carrying by the guards, not the picture. After that, we show some of the drawings or collages and other things that use the picture but in a different way. So sometimes we discuss it, but I think it's great that we have this topic here today, because like a huge issue about the trauma, I'm not sure it was a topic in Bulgaria at all. And also we very rarely have the chance to talk and the time to talk about the pure journalism or editor issues. So thank you for
My pleasure. And the one thing I'd say is with the trauma stuff, it's important that you don't make it a one-off, because often, good journalists get promoted to editors, editors get promoted to editors-in-chief, bad journalists get fired, you hire new ones. So all that to say is, like, if you do it once and think, oh, we've done it, we've covered our bases, and then you don't do it again for 2 years, you're going to end up with the same problem again and again. When I was head of news for the European Broadcasting Union in Geneva, I had group counseling. It wasn't ideal, it was just an attempt for my team every 6 months, obligatory, because I felt they were seeing too much content. Now, it was a very particular situation where they were seeing a lot of content because that was their role, but we did it every 6 months, because then it meant that everybody knew people were covered, things like that.
There is a question. I think she was first.
Okay, sorry. The one I saw.
Thank you. I just wanted to share a comment, not so much a question, but the fact that you spent more than 1/3 of your presentation discussing the traumatic consequences on these journalists who deal with content just leads me to think that maybe now with the availability of user-generated content and EyeWitness content, it only stresses even more the spectacularization of violence that has existed beforehand, which is now driven to some horrible extreme. And maybe instead of putting plans around reporters who deal with this content, this should prompt us to start a more philosophical conversation in the media with regard to ethics, how far we want to go with that spectacularization. If now we can show parts of blown up heads, should we, right? And how good or bad, or what does that do to us, but also to our audiences, and take a step back, possibly?
Totally agree with you. I mean, so I'll make, just in response, just 2 points very quickly. If we go back to ISIS, as we just discussed before, you know, in an ISIS video, I'm stealing from Gavin Rees, who's a European director of the Dart Center. He makes a point that in an ISIS video, there are 2 victims. There's a victim who's just been burnt alive, decapitated, whatever, and then there's you, right? The person who then sees it, right? So they're actually very smart, and there's 2 victims in that video. And because we as news organizations are like, you know, hounds, vultures, we automatically have this reflex of going after it. Now, I think with ISIS that's changed in the last year. People have become wise to it, and for instance, Belgian television VRT, the public broadcaster in Belgium, refuses now to show any ISIS videos, will not show an ISIS video. Ergo, none of their journalists are allowed to watch ISIS videos. In terms of what we should show to our audience, so there I probably agree with you overall. The problem is, regardless in what we choose to show to our audiences, if we're using social media to news gather, take Virginia shootings, for instance, right? We're going to, as journalists, we're going to be impacted by it. We're going to see this content, even if we decide not to put it out. So we need to also make sure we're not just protecting the audience, but we're protecting ourselves as journalists. So that's why I wanted to emphasize the trauma side of it. Because that's our news gathering role, right, is to find this content, even if we don't decide to publish it.
Yeah. The other question.
Hello, thank you for the interesting presentation. Actually, there's been a sort of a parallel discussion going on in Twitter, whether in the era of eyewitness content, there is actually a juxtaposition between citizen journalists and professionals, or do you think there is this type of duality going on now, or can we say it's more of a symbiosis where citizen journalists sort of feed off the content, and then professional journalists can do their job better into analyzing it and comparing it and providing valuable commentary?
I would lean towards the latter, because, for 2 reasons really. Number one, most citizen journalists, if we call them that, I would say are accidental journalists. So often people just see something, they see an event, be that, you know, a car crash, God forbid, you know, outside this building, or something, you know, 10 times more horrific. And they just happen to be at the wrong place at the wrong time, or the right place at the wrong time, whatever. And their reflex, as we saw with Jordi Mia, and it really was a reflex, because that's the world we live in, was to film it and put it on Facebook. Okay? So in terms of citizen journalists as a body, or as an ongoing body, I would say the membership of that body is changing all the time, right? Apart from some people who probably would call themselves citizen journalists, but really they're veering into just being journalists, right? If you're chasing stories, you're not a citizen journalist anymore, you're a journalist, really, I would argue. So where it becomes important for us as journalists then is to make sense of all that. And our role is becoming more and more and more important to do that. And I think there's somebody after me going to talk about verification and things like that. Our role to tell the story of what's really happening, in inverted commas, and I use it really very loosely, to help people understand what's happening is becoming more important. So 5 years ago, I think you'd hear this kind of argument that, oh, citizen journalism is going to be the death of mainstream journalism. I would argue it's the actually 180 degrees opposite. Citizen journalism is a reinvigoration of the importance of journalism today. And I don't know if you know, for instance, the organization, which is all part of the First Draft Coalition, reportedly They're only based on Twitter and Instagram, although they have a website now. But what they do as journalists is reach out into these citizen journalism networks and then help tell the story, help them tell the story of what's going on, tell the stories that are not making it to the mainstream. And I think there's that space there to move into and to do a really good job. Does that help answer your question?
There was one other question at the back, and I would take one more if you want, and we really have to finish. If there is anyone else. Okay, after the lady.
Thank you for your presentation. It was useful, and I'm glad that someone talks about how the journalist feels, because it's something that a lot of people neglect. I think even professionals, especially professionals. But I want to ask something else. What if the truth is so ugly that you have no other choice than to show it that way? I mean, what if sometimes you don't have other choice? You have to show the people that think, the body parts, even that, so that they could be shocked and the response could be positive. I know it's strange to look at it that way, but sometimes people should be shocked so that they could respond in the right way, because sometimes they're just passive and they don't react the way they should.
I think you're right. I think there are instances where that has to be done. It's a really, really great point. I think the best example recently is the picture of Aylan Kurdi, the boy on the beach, as we talked about. You know, I advocated very strongly that that picture should be shown on the front page of every news organization ever, because we had to know what's going on. Now, there's another question to be asked, you know, well, what impact does that have really down the road, you know? Maybe it had an impact for 2 weeks, and then we've kind of gone back into our stupor again. I think there are times when trauma and the real horrors of human existence have to be shown, and it's our job to show them. I think we have to be careful about how often we do it, and we have to do it at the right time. But I think it's really, really good point and really important to think about that. Yeah, agreed.
And the last question.
Hello. First, thank you for raising the discussion about trauma in media. That's really important topic that we are not talking about in Bulgaria, except few medias here. And second, I want to add up to Konstantina's question. How would you define journalists in 2015? Who is journalist? Who can call themselves journalists? Because we were having this discussion on Twitter about citizen journalism and like real journalism, and how we can separate them, and what is the thing you have to do to be like real journalist.
Konstantin, right? Very good. I think the issue is about trying to help people make sense of what's going on. Okay? And I think anybody can do that. Now, I think a citizen journalist or an accidental journalist is somebody who just sees something and reports on it, right? I think the role of the journalist today, more than ever, is to help people understand and to help the audiences work out what is going on. And I think, unfortunately, and this goes to a deeper, broader question on journalism, not social media, there's a trend, unfortunately, in certain countries to use the word journalism to spread a message, right? To spread an opinion, a view. I mean, it's always been the case, of course, but it's increasingly prevalent. And I think the role of everybody in this room, I would argue, hopefully, is to actually try and give a balanced view and explain to people what is actually going on. And I think where social media comes in is we've never had as big an opportunity to be able to tell both sides of what's going on, right? In the past, the voice was always with the power. Today, it's not only, it's predominantly still with the power, of course, but it's not only with the power. And I think, going back to my example of Reportedly is an organization which is doing a great job of helping those voices that are only on social media be a little bit louder and tell both sides of that story. Does that answer?
Okay, thank you, Sam, for your great contribution. I think we've raised really important questions.